Beirut, Lebanon, 1994. Through the cramped streets of the southern suburbs, a funeral procession makes its way, an area locals call the Dahir. Behind a coffin draped in flags, hundreds of mourners march, their voices rising in prayers and chants. Black-clad women openly weep. Men hold high photographs of the fallen. A young fighter, killed in confrontations with Israeli forces near the border. With reverent slowness, the procession advances through streets flanked by concrete apartment towers, bearing the scars of decades of civil conflict. Overhead, laundry sways from balconies. From doorways, children observe. Shopkeepers set aside their tasks to witness the cortege passing by. This community has laid to rest many of its sons, and these funerals have evolved into rituals blending grief with defiance, occasions when the living pay tribute to the dead and reaffirm their dedication to resistance. What remains unknown to everyone in that gathering is that, concealed within the procession, are 5 individuals who have no place there. Their dark clothing matches that of fellow mourners. The photographs they carry are identical. The prayers they chant in flawless Arabic are the same. Yet they are not Lebanese. They hold no allegiance to Hezbollah. They are Israeli operatives from Mossad's Caesarea unit. Their purpose is not mourning. Their purpose is assassination. 10 meters ahead of them walks the target. Imad Mugniyah, age 32, serves as Hezbollah's chief of external security operations. This is the individual who orchestrated the 1,983 bombings targeting the U.S. Embassy and Marine barracks in Beirut, attacks that claimed over 300 lives. This is the person responsible for kidnapping and murdering CIA Station Chief William Buckley, who endured months of torture before dying. This is the architect behind the hijacking of TWA Flight 847, during which U.S. Navy diver Robert Stetham was brutally beaten and shot, his body abandoned on the Beirut tarmac. Israel has pursued this man for more than 10 years, a target who has evaded numerous assassination attempts through extreme paranoia, meticulous operational security, and an almost uncanny instinct for detecting danger. Today, however, Mughniyeh has committed an error. He has shown up at a funeral for one of his operatives, trusting that the crowd offers protection. He remains unaware that Israeli intelligence has monitored this funeral for days, awaiting confirmation of his attendance. He does not realize that the 5 mourners trailing him have practiced this operation for weeks in a recreation of these precise streets, constructed in a classified facility within the Negev desert. He has no knowledge that underneath their traditional mourning garments, they conceal weapons engineered for quick, silent kills in crowded environments. The procession rounds a corner. The street becomes narrower. Buildings close in from both sides. The crowd grows denser. Bodies squeeze together due to the restricted space. This location represents the killing ground Mossad has selected. Within roughly 90 seconds, Imad Mugniyah will be dead. The operation about to unfold has consumed years of planning, incorporating surveillance spanning 3 continents, the recruitment of local assets who endanger their lives providing intelligence, and a level of boldness that even experienced Mossad officers regarded as nearly reckless. Infiltrating a Hezbollah funeral procession deep within their stronghold, encircled by armed fighters who would execute suspected Israeli agents immediately, represented an operational risk that few intelligence organizations would tolerate. Israel had determined, however, that Mughniyeh constituted a threat substantial enough to warrant extraordinary measures. His operations had resulted in hundreds of deaths among Israelis, Americans, and others. His network stretched throughout the Middle East, Europe, and South America. His connection to Iranian intelligence supplied Hezbollah with resources and expertise that transformed the organization into something far more formidable than it might otherwise have been. Most importantly, he was developing new operations that Israeli intelligence assessed would include attacks within Israel's borders, potentially utilizing the networks he had constructed to transport operatives and weapons across the frontier. This is the account of how Mossad converted a funeral into an execution site, how intelligence organizations manipulate cultural rituals that communities regard as sacred, how 5 individuals entered hostile territory, lacking any escape strategy beyond disappearing into pandemonium, and how one of the planet's most hunted terrorists perished while surrounded by his own community, who never suspected that assassins stood in their midst until events had already unfolded. Comprehending how Mossad eliminated Imad Mugniyah necessitates understanding his identity and his transformation into the most dangerous individual Israel had failed to capture. Born in 1962 within Beirut's Shiite slums, Mughniyeh matured amid poverty and sectarian conflict. His father passed away during his youth, leaving his mother to raise 6 children in a 2-room dwelling, where water came from a shared tap and electricity operated intermittently. He observed his older brothers joining Palestinian militant organizations throughout the 1,970 seconds. Absorbing from childhood that armed resistance represented how the powerless confronted the powerful, how the dispossessed challenged those controlling everything. During the 1,970 seconds, Lebanon descended into civil war, a struggle that would persist for 15 years and claim over 150,000 lives. Beirut, formerly known as the Paris of the Middle East, fractured into a patchwork of militia-dominated neighborhoods where crossing invisible lines could result in death. Mughniyeh's neighborhood fell under the control of various Palestinian factions, utilizing Lebanese territory for launching strikes against Israel. Israeli retaliation arrived through airstrikes, commando operations, and artillery attacks that killed civilians and combatants without discrimination, generating cycles of violence that perpetuated themselves. At age 15, Mughniyeh enlisted in Force 17, a Palestinian militant organization linked to Yasser Arafat's Fatah faction. Too young for combat roles, they employed him as a messenger, transporting communications between safe houses and weapons storage sites. He absorbed knowledge of how armed groups functioned, how they navigated through hostile areas, how they concealed themselves from Israeli monitoring, and how they designed operations with minimal resources against a vastly superior adversary. He developed tactical thinking, learned to recognize weaknesses in security arrangements, and learned to capitalize on moments of complacency that even professional security personnel could not completely eliminate. His genuine education occurred following the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, when Israeli forces seized Beirut and forced PLO leadership into exile. The invasion represented Israel's effort to dismantle Palestinian military infrastructure in Lebanon and establish a sympathetic Christian administration that would negotiate a peace agreement. The invasion generated something Israel had not foreseen, however. Hezbollah, the Party of God, a Shiite resistance organization sponsored by Iran that would become far more threatening than the Palestinian groups it supplanted. Mughniyeh joined Hezbollah's military division in 1983, contributing skills and knowledge that rendered him valuable despite his age. He possessed expertise in explosives, acquired from Palestinian bomb makers. He understood urban combat, having battled Israeli forces during the invasion. And he grasped intelligence operations, having devoted years to observing how effective operations were conceived and carried out. Hezbollah's leadership identified his capabilities and dispatched him to Iran for sophisticated training with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which was cultivating Hezbollah as its proxy in Lebanon. The Iranian training lasted 6 months and transformed Mughniyeh from a street combatant into a professional operative. Iranian instructors, numerous among them, trained by Western intelligence organizations prior to the 1979 revolution, imparted surveillance methodologies, operational security practices, interrogation techniques, and the craft of constructing networks capable of surviving penetration by hostile intelligence. They instructed him on compartmentalizing operations so individual arrests could not jeopardize entire networks. They taught him utilizing fear as a tool, how psychological operations could achieve goals that military strength could not accomplish. And they taught him patience, the recognition that successful operations frequently demanded months or years of preparation. Upon Mughniyeh's return to Beirut in late 1983, he immediately implemented his training. On April 18, 1983, a suicide truck bomb obliterated the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, ending 63 lives, among them 17 Americans. The assault served as Hezbollah's declaration that American forces supporting the Christian-dominated Lebanese government would suffer consequences for their intervention. 6 months afterward, on October 23rd, 2 additional truck bombs devastated the U.S. Marine barracks and French military headquarters, killing 241 American servicemen and 58 French paratroopers. These attacks constituted the deadliest single-day casualty count for the U.S. military since the Vietnam War, and compelled President Reagan to withdraw American forces from Lebanon within months. Mughniyeh orchestrated both operations. He identified the targets, enlisted the suicide bombers, constructed the explosive devices, and synchronized the attacks with precision that astonished Western intelligence organizations. The bombs were enormous, exceeding 12,000 pounds of explosives in each vehicle, sufficient to bring down reinforced concrete structures. The timing was coordinated, demonstrating synchronization between cells operating independently until the attack moment. And the secrecy surrounding the planning was so absolute that American and Israeli intelligence received no advance warning, despite maintaining extensive surveillance networks in Beirut. The triumph of these operations cemented Mughniyeh's standing within Hezbollah and Iranian intelligence circles. He assumed the role of the organization's chief of external security operations, accountable for designing attacks against Israeli and Western targets beyond Lebanon. He created networks throughout Europe and South America, recruiting operatives from Lebanese diaspora populations who could travel using Western passports and function without drawing scrutiny. He forged connections with additional militant groups, including Palestinian factions, the Irish Republican Army, and various Latin American guerrilla movements, establishing a worldwide network capable of supplying logistical assistance, armaments, and safe locations. Between 1983 and 1992, Mughniyeh directed a campaign of abductions, hijackings, and bombings that elevated him to one of the world's most wanted individuals. His operatives abducted Western hostages in Beirut, including CIA Station Chief William Buckley, who underwent torture for intelligence regarding American operations in Lebanon. Buckley's torture, extending over months and documented on videotape transmitted to the CIA, furnished Hezbollah with comprehensive knowledge of American intelligence networks throughout the Middle East. His death while captive represented one of the CIA's most humiliating defeats, a demonstration that even senior intelligence personnel remained vulnerable when operating in hostile territories. In 1985, Mughniyeh orchestrated the hijacking of TWA Flight 847, which departed Athens destined for Rome, transporting 153 passengers and crew members. His operatives commandeered control of the aircraft, compelled the pilots to redirect to Beirut, and detained passengers hostage for 17 days while demanding the liberation of Shiite prisoners detained by Israel. Throughout the hijacking, they assaulted and murdered Robert Stetham, a U.S. Navy diver, executing him with a shot to the head and discarding his body on the tarmac. The hijacking garnered international media attention, with journalists broadcasting live from Beirut airport as negotiations extended. Eventually, Israel discreetly released the prisoners, and the hijackers vanished into Beirut's southern suburbs, territory Hezbollah controlled and where protection could be guaranteed. Israeli intelligence had tracked Mughniyeh since the 1983 embassy bombing. His dossier at Mossad headquarters comprised hundreds of pages documenting his operations, networks, travel patterns, and security procedures. They understood he seldom remained at a single location for more than one night. They knew he avoided using telephones, relying exclusively on trusted couriers for communication. They recognized he maintained multiple bodyguards and journeyed in vehicle convoys that constantly altered routes. They knew he had survived no fewer than 3 prior assassination attempts, including a 1,985 car bomb that instead killed his brother. Yet they also identified his vulnerability, family and devotion to Hezbollah. He participated in weddings, funerals, and religious observances, understanding that declining to do so would broadcast paranoia, potentially undermining his standing within the organization. These gatherings represented the sole occasions he manifested in public, enveloped by crowds offering both concealment and potential observers. Israeli intelligence concluded that identifying one of these gatherings beforehand might generate an opportunity to eliminate him. The breakthrough arrived in February 1994, when a Mossad asset embedded within Hezbollah conveyed that a senior operative had perished in combat near the Israeli border. The operative, Hassan Nasrallah's cousin, held sufficient importance that his funeral would attract senior leadership. The asset suggested that Mughniyeh would probably attend, given the deceased had operated under his authority and because absence would offend Nasrallah, who was ascending within Hezbollah's structure and whose backing Mughniyeh required. The intelligence reached Caesarea Unit, Mossad's division, accountable for targeted eliminations abroad. Caesarea's commander, whose identity remains protected, examined the intelligence and concluded that the funeral offered a workable opportunity. Beirut's southern suburbs constituted hostile ground where Israeli operatives could not maneuver openly without risking apprehension or execution. However, a funeral procession would prove fluid, chaotic, populated with strangers arriving from various neighborhoods to offer respects. 5 operatives could conceivably penetrate the crowd, neutralize the target, and flee amid the confusion before Hezbollah security comprehended what had transpired. The strategy was audacious and entailed tremendous risks. Should the operatives be identified before reaching the target, they would face capture and execution. Hezbollah interrogators operated without the legal constraints confronting Western intelligence agencies, and they possessed experience extracting information through torture. Should the operation fail and operatives be seized, the intelligence compromise could prove catastrophic. Yet the chance to eliminate Mughniyeh might not present itself again. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin authorized the operation. The determination was reached in a secure conference facility in Jerusalem where Rabin, Defense Minister Shimon Peres, and senior Mossad officials examined the plan's particulars. Rabin inquired about extraction routes, contingency arrangements if the operation was exposed, and the probability of civilian casualties. Caesarea's commander recognized the hazards, but stressed that Mughniyeh's elimination would substantially diminish Hezbollah's operational capacity and transmit the message that nobody who killed Israelis remained beyond reach. Rabin endorsed the Authorization directive, appending a handwritten notation that the operation should advance only if field commanders felt confident about extracting the operatives successfully. He wished to avoid Israeli agents being captured and displayed on television, handing Hezbollah a propaganda triumph. The authorization was relayed to Caesarea through a coded transmission containing no operational details, merely confirmation that the Prime Minister had approved it. 5 operatives were chosen from Caesarea's most seasoned agents. Their identities remain classified, safeguarded by Israeli secrecy regulations, preventing disclosure of intelligence personnel identities even decades following operations. Intelligence sources characterize them as Arabic-speaking Israeli Jews from Middle Eastern origins who could credibly appear Lebanese in looks, accent, and cultural conduct. They had previously operated in Lebanon during Israel's 18-year occupation of the South and comprehended the dangers of working in Hezbollah-controlled areas. The operatives devoted 2 weeks to preparation. They examined videos of Lebanese funerals, noting how mourners dressed, moved, what prayers they recited, and how processions organized themselves. They rehearsed the operation in a training complex constructed to duplicate Beirut's southern suburbs, featuring narrow streets, concrete structures, and crowds of role players simulating a funeral procession. They practiced advancing through crowds without attracting notice, locating the target amid chaos, executing the elimination, and withdrawing through predetermined pathways. The selected weapons were suppressed pistols loaded with hollow-point ammunition engineered to expand upon impact, maximizing internal destruction while minimizing risk of projectiles passing through the target and striking bystanders. Each operative carried 2 magazines, adequate ammunition to neutralize the target and confront bodyguards if required. They also possessed small explosive devices designed to generate confusion and facilitate their escape by detonating in alleyways distant from the procession. On the morning of February 16, 1994, the operatives penetrated Lebanon through the Israeli-controlled security zone in the south. They traveled independently using counterfeit Lebanese identification papers and operating vehicles registered to southern Lebanon addresses. Israeli military intelligence had coordinated with Lebanese Christian militia forces controlling checkpoints approaching Beirut, guaranteeing the operatives could transit without being halted for thorough inspection. The funeral was scheduled for 2 p.m. The operatives reached the southern suburbs by noon, parking in separate locations and proceeding on foot to predetermined positions near the mosque, hosting the funeral service. They wore dark clothing suitable for mourning, carrying nothing, identifying them as foreign agents. Each memorized his operational role, his procession, position, and his withdrawal route. They communicated through abbreviated phrases transmitted via small radios hidden beneath their garments, confirming positions and preparedness. At 1:45 p.m., Hezbollah security personnel began assembling at the mosque. Dozens of armed individuals in civilian attire established a perimeter, verifying identification of approaching individuals and monitoring rooftops for dangers. The operatives observed from cafes and shops, documenting guard placements and recognizing vulnerabilities in the security barrier where they could integrate into the procession. The security was substantial but not impervious. Hezbollah anticipated threats from Israeli air attacks or vehicle bombs, not from foot infiltrators blending into crowds. At 2 p.m., the funeral service commenced inside the mosque. Mourners filled the prayer hall, overflowing into the courtyard where loudspeakers transmitted the imam's eulogy. The operatives joined the courtyard crowd, kneeling when others knelt, bowing when others bowed, reciting prayers they had committed to memory phonetically. Nobody challenged their presence. In a community where funerals were public gatherings attended by hundreds, strangers were anticipated. At 2:30 p.m., the coffin emerged from the mosque. 6 individuals lifted it onto their shoulders, while others grasped flags and photographs of the deceased. The procession formed, extending backward over 100 meters, as mourners arranged themselves in line. The operatives positioned themselves centrally within the procession, sufficiently close to access the target, yet not so proximate that they would be near the densest concentration of bodyguards. Imad Mugniyah materialized 10 minutes after the procession commenced. He had remained inside the mosque, but surfaced from a side exit, merging with the procession after it was already advancing. This represented his typical security procedure, never arriving at events beginning when security forces might maintain maximum alertness, always joining after crowds had assembled and attention had shifted toward main activities. He wore dark clothing matching other mourners and walked without bodyguards immediately adjacent, recognizing that conspicuous security would identify him to surveillance. The operatives recognized him instantly. They had analyzed his photographs for weeks, memorizing his facial structure, his gait, his mannerisms. One operative transmitted a concise radio message. "Target confirmed." The others acknowledged with double transmitter clicks, confirming their positioning and readiness to proceed. The procession advanced through streets scarcely wide enough for the crowd. Buildings loomed close, their facades marked by bullet holes from previous conflicts. Children gazed from windows. Women stood in doorways. Shopkeepers watched from behind metal shutters. The operatives moved with the crowd, chanting prayers, appearing indistinguishable from other mourners. They allowed the distance between themselves and Mughniyeh to diminish gradually, avoiding rushing, avoiding forcing forward in manners that might draw attention. The narrow street designated for the killing lay 3 blocks ahead. The operatives knew the location from their reconnaissance and planning. It represented a bottleneck where the procession would decelerate and compress, where flanking buildings created confined space-limiting escape routes for bodyguards, where the operatives could strike then vanish into alleyways, leading to pre-positioned vehicles. At 3:15 p.m., the procession entered the killing ground. The street constricted to barely 4 meters width. The crowd compressed, bodies pressing together. The operatives now positioned less than 10 meters from Mughniyeh, close enough to distinguish his profile, close enough to observe him speaking quietly to an adjacent individual, close enough to execute. The lead operative transmitted, "Execute." 3 operatives withdrew their weapons simultaneously. The suppressed pistols produced soft clicking sounds, barely perceptible above the crowd's noise. The first operative discharged twice, both rounds impacting Mughniyeh in the upper back. The second operative fired 3 times, striking him in the neck and head. The third operative engaged a bodyguard reaching for a weapon, delivering 2 rounds into his chest before he could draw. Mughniyeh collapsed forward into the individuals ahead. Blood sprayed across their clothing. For 3 seconds, nobody comprehended what had transpired. The sounds of the discharges were too subdued to register as gunfire. People assumed someone had collapsed from heat or grief. Then they witnessed the blood, the wounds, the weapons in the operatives' hands. Chaos detonated. People screamed, some advancing toward the gunfire, others retreating from it. The coffin was abandoned as its bearers dispersed. Bodyguards drew weapons, scanning the crowd for threats, yet unable to identify who had fired. The operatives were already moving, forcing through the panicked crowd toward the alleyways they had surveyed. 2 detonated small explosive devices in side streets, generating loud explosions that diverted security forces' attention from their actual withdrawal routes. Within 60 seconds of the shooting, the operatives had vanished into the labyrinth of back streets and alleyways crisscrossing the southern suburbs. They separated, each proceeding toward different vehicles. Behind them, Hezbollah's security forces were securing the location, attempting to control the crowd, searching for suspects who had already departed. Imad Mugniyah was deceased before medics arrived. 3 projectiles had struck critical areas, causing catastrophic trauma that would have proven fatal even with immediate surgical care. His bodyguards transported his body into a nearby structure, refusing Lebanese police or ambulance personnel access until Hezbollah's own medical staff arrived. They understood that Israeli intelligence frequently attempted confirming successful assassinations through intercepted communications or surveillance of medical responses, and they wished to withhold that confirmation. Yet the truth could not remain concealed. Within hours, Hezbollah declared that a senior commander had perished in a martyrdom operation, their term for assassination. They initially withheld identifying Mughniyeh by name, understanding that doing so would confirm his death to Israeli intelligence. However, word circulated through the southern suburbs via networks of fighters and supporters who had known him. By evening, Lebanese media were broadcasting that Imad Mugniyah, among Hezbollah's most feared operatives, had been killed by unidentified gunmen. The operatives reached the Israeli-controlled zone by 6 p.m., crossing back into Israel through identical checkpoints they had utilized that morning. They underwent immediate debriefing, furnishing detailed operation accounts, identifying what had succeeded and what had not, and evaluating whether operational security had been compromised. Mossad analysts reviewed the reports and determined that the operation had been a complete triumph. The target was deceased. All operatives had withdrawn without injury, and no Israeli evidence remained at the scene definitively proving Israeli involvement. Something was wrong, however. Within days, Hezbollah released photographs of Mughniyeh's body at his funeral. The individual in the photographs was not the person the operatives had killed. He resembled him in appearance, wore similar clothing, and had occupied approximately the correct position within the procession. Yet detailed facial structure analysis, confirmed through comparison with verified Mughniyeh photographs, revealed that Mossad had eliminated the wrong individual. The victim was Mustafa Dirani, among Mughniyeh's bodyguards, and a senior Hezbollah operative in his own capacity. He had been walking beside Mughniyeh during the procession, conversing with him, matching his movements so precisely that from 10 meters away within a moving crowd, the operatives had misidentified him as the target. Mughniyeh himself had been walking several meters away, partially concealed by other mourners, and had survived the assault. The realization proved devastating. Mossad had executed a near-flawless operation, penetrating hostile territory, striking amid a funeral procession, and escaping without casualties. Yet, they had failed achieving the primary objective due to a targeting error committed in the chaos of a moving crowd. The error recalled the 1973 Lillehammer disaster, when Mossad had killed an innocent Moroccan waiter after misidentifying him as a Palestinian terrorist. The Dirani killing was less catastrophic given the victim represented a legitimate military target. However, the failure to eliminate Mughniyeh meant the operation's strategic purpose remained unachieved. Within Mossad, the operation was categorized as a partial success. A senior Hezbollah operative had been neutralized, degrading the organization's capabilities. Israeli audacity had been exhibited, conveying the message that Mossad could penetrate Hezbollah's stronghold and eliminate senior leaders, even when encircled by security forces. Yet the primary target remained alive, more paranoid than previously, and now aware that Israel was prepared to risk operatives in funeral processions to eliminate him. Mughniyeh would survive another 14 years, continuing to design operations against Israeli and Western targets. He became increasingly cautious, participating in fewer public gatherings, employing multiple body doubles, and traveling in convoys equipped with electronic countermeasures against tracking devices. Israeli intelligence would attempt multiple times to eliminate him, yet each attempt failed. He appeared to possess an extraordinary capacity to detect danger, to identify surveillance, to recognize traps before they sprung. His death would ultimately arrive in February 2008 inches, Damascus, Syria, when a car bomb exploded outside a shopping complex in the Kafr Souza neighborhood. The bomb was positioned in the spare tire of a Mitsubishi Pajero parked beside Mughniyeh's vehicle. When he departed a reception and entered his car, the bomb detonated, killing him instantly. Syrian authorities blamed Israel, which maintained its customary policy of neither confirming nor denying responsibility. Western intelligence sources confirmed, however, that Mossad and CIA had collaborated in tracking Mughniyeh to Damascus and executing the operation that finally eliminated him following 25 years of pursuit. The 1,994 funeral operation remains classified. The Israeli government has never officially acknowledged its occurrence. Hezbollah has never publicly identified the operatives who killed Durrani. The sole evidence the operation occurred derives from intelligence sources who spoke to journalists under anonymity conditions, providing details matching patterns of previous Mossad operations and explaining outcomes that otherwise made minimal sense. What the operation disclosed was both the capabilities and constraints of targeted killing as a counter-terrorism approach. Mossad demonstrated that with adequate resources, planning, and willingness to accept risk, intelligence organizations could strike targets anywhere, even in hostile territory surrounded by armed adversaries. Yet the operation also demonstrated that even the most advanced intelligence agencies commit errors, that targeting mistakes occur even following extensive planning, and that eliminating individual leaders rarely prevents terrorist organizations from continuing operations. Hezbollah did not disintegrate following Durrani's death. It did not even decelerate. New commanders received promotions, new operations were designed, new attacks were carried out. The organization proved resilient because it was structured as a movement rather than a hierarchy dependent upon individual leaders. Eliminating one commander, even a senior one, simply created opportunity for another to ascend. The cycle persisted, each death fueling the next generation's dedication to resistance. For the operatives who executed the funeral operation, the psychological burden was measured in the awareness that they had endangered their lives to eliminate the wrong individual. Intelligence operatives received training to compartmentalize, to separate mission objectives from personal emotions, to accept that operations sometimes fail despite optimal efforts. Yet the funeral operation's failure was not attributable to inadequate planning or insufficient preparation. It resulted from a split-second targeting decision made amid the chaos of a moving crowd, a decision irreversible once projectiles were discharged. The operation became a case study within Mossad, analyzed in training courses for new operatives as an illustration of how even meticulously planned operations can fail due to factors beyond planners' control. Instructors emphasized the importance of positive target identification before engaging, the hazards of making assumptions about target location based on incomplete intelligence, and the necessity for extraction plans accounting for the possibility that operations might not achieve their objectives. Yet the operation also reinforced a darker reality about intelligence work, that sometimes the sole method of reaching high-value targets is accepting risks that conventional military operations would classify as unacceptable. That infiltrating enemy territory, operating without support, and striking in environments where discovery means death represents the price intelligence agencies pay for achieving objectives that conventional forces cannot accomplish. The funeral operation was not Mossad's most successful assassination. That distinction belongs to operations achieving their objectives cleanly, eliminating targets without collateral damage or operational errors. Yet it was perhaps among the most audacious, a demonstration that Israeli intelligence was prepared to dispatch operatives into the heart of enemy territory, to stand among armed fighters who would execute them without hesitation if discovered, and to strike even when surrounded by individuals who wanted them dead. Whether that audacity was justified by strategic objectives remains debated among intelligence professionals. Critics contend that targeted killings rarely achieve enduring strategic effects, that they create martyrs inspiring new generations of fighters, and that they perpetuate cycles of violence rather than terminating them. Supporters maintain that eliminating dangerous individuals prevents specific attacks, degrades enemy capabilities, and demonstrates resolve that deters future aggression. What is indisputable is that the funeral operation reveals something fundamental about modern intelligence warfare. That the boundary between success and failure can be measured in meters and seconds, that even the most carefully planned operations depend upon factors beyond planners' control, and that operatives who accept missions in hostile territory do so, recognizing that mistakes can prove fatal, not merely to themselves, but to the objectives they risk their lives to achieve. The funeral procession that wound through Beirut's southern suburbs in February 1994 buried one individual and created another martyr. Mustafa Durrani's death was mourned by Hezbollah supporters, who regarded him as a hero killed by Israeli assassins. His funeral days afterward attracted thousands, becoming another demonstration of defiance against Israeli operations in Lebanon. Imad Mugniyah attended that funeral as well, standing among the mourners, more vigilant than before, surrounded by bodyguards, cognizant that he had survived an assassination attempt through sheer chance. And somewhere in Israel, 5 operatives who had risked everything to eliminate him returned to ordinary existences, carrying the knowledge that they had come within meters of one of history's most successful assassinations, only to fail because of a targeting error that could not have been prevented. They would carry that knowledge for the remainder of their lives, along with the understanding that in the realm of intelligence operations, there exist no perfect successes, only missions that achieve sufficient objectives to justify the risks undertaken to execute them.